Good morning, good morning, good morning. How are we? This is our last crime and punishment session of this term. Well, actually, our last crime and punishment session altogether because it's the end of the topic. And lots of ideas coming in about if you break the law, which era of time would you prefer to have lived in and why? Lots of people saying potentially this era because there's less death involved and it's a lot less harsh. And we're very much based on the idea of rehabilitation. A really interesting one to get into. Now, what we're going to look at today is we're going to have a big kind of recap, and we're going to be working on the skill of chronology. Now, chronology is a really tricky one because chronology is kind of the order that things happen in. And lots of people think in order to be good at history, you need to know lots and lots of dates. Well, you absolutely don't, because for example, if you can't spell a word, you look it up in a dictionary. Well, if you can't remember a date, you just look it up. But what you do need to understand is chronology, how things evolved and changed through time and where all of the time periods fit together. Because obviously, if we're in 2023 now, all of our history is built on top, one event after the other, to make us who we are today. And so you kind of need to know how all of that puzzle fits together, and you need to, and that's really a chronological understanding. And the words we tend to use are continuity and change. So continuity is things that have stayed the same, and change is things that have changed and evolved. And so what we've been looking at is we've been looking at different periods of time. And we've been looking at the evolution of crime and punishment. And we've seen that as we've been going. We've seen the change in attitudes, how the attitudes change from one of retribution to reformation, sort of reforming, of reformation. We've seen the change and the development in the punishments that were used, in the types of punishments that were used. And so if you take a theme and you look at it all through history, it's the best way of understanding chronology and how things have changed and what eras of time saw the most change and what eras of time potentially saw regressions, which is going backwards, and what periods of time kind of, saw the least amount of change. So that's kind of what we're going to look at a little bit today. And the question that we're going to start with is, how has the face of crime changed in the 19th and 20th century? So we kind of ended last week with the Victorian era, and we talked about Victorian prisons, and we talked about the creation of the police service, the first kind of professional police service. Again, another change, this idea that the Industrial Revolution caused this massive boom in population and this huge movement of people from the countryside to the town to take up work in the factories. And therefore, because of that particular era, you see a much greater acceleration of change with the creation of prisons and the creation of a professional police service. But let's now start to think about moving forward from the Victorian era. If you think about society today, how has crime changed? What sort of crime do we have now? Because we certainly, for example, don't have people accusing other people of witchcraft, for example. We certainly probably still have a bit of poaching, but we probably have far less issues with people poaching rabbits on somebody's land. And last time I checked, we don't have highway people on horseback. So how has crime changed? What sort of crimes do we tend to have now? If police officers are working today, what sort of crime has changed? So I don't want things that are the same. We're still going to have theft and sadly murder and things like that. But what's changed? So that's that changing. What do we have now that we probably didn't have in the Victorian era? Cybercrime. Absolutely. Cybercrime is a real good example of a crime that we have today that we probably didn't have as much. We didn't have at all until we obviously invented computers. So if you went back to the Victorian era, there definitely wouldn't have been cybercrime. Stealing and robbing from people wouldn't has happened through the whole of time. So that's definitely not a change. Speeding, absolutely. So speeding in cars would be another thing that is a modern crime. Stealing of motorbikes and cars would be a modern crime. Credit card fraud. So yeah, where people kind of clone your credit cards, or they take, they kind of hack into your bank and sort of take some of your money. So again, banks are a fairly modern thing. So again, people tended to just carry all their cash with them. If you remember, that's why highway robbers declined, was the invention of the bank. But yeah, absolutely. So driving too fast, online scams and telephone scams. Absolutely. I had one yesterday, funnily enough. I very rarely answer my mobile unless I know the number, but I had one yesterday. Drink driving, absolutely. So people that drink alcohol and then drive, which is another one. People being naughty with drones, that's definitely a more modern crime. That is a really interesting one. That comes up quite regularly on our local group, about somebody that's flying a drone over their garden and they don't give permission for their video to be taken on a drone. So yeah, definitely. I'm not sure it's a crime, but yeah, absolutely. So dangerous driving, which we had. Parking on double yellow lines, that's definitely a modern crime, but it is against the law to park on double yellow lines. Using your mobile when you're in the car. I've got my picture. Obviously, you don't get into trouble for just using your mobile. Like using your mobile in the car or while operating dangerous machinery is another one. Joyriding is another one. Not wearing a seatbelt is another one. Theft of cars, which we had. Oh, my computer's frozen. It's really struggling today. Speeding in your car. Not stopping when involved in an accident in your car. Driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Now, think about all of these crimes here. These are all because of the invention of the car, and these are all linked to driving. So there's an awful lot of crimes that we now have because of our reliance on using cars. And so therefore, the face of crime has really, really changed. But there's lots of other ones that you've also mentioned. So things like cybercrime is absolutely another one. But there's also things that you haven't spoken about. So football hooliganism. If you kind of Google what modern crimes, are more modern crimes, football hooliganism comes up. Terrorism is another one. So terrorism is very much a more modern, not to say that it hasn't happened in history, but it's far more of a modern threat. And also knife crime, so people carrying knives around with them, and particularly young people involved in kind of those things. And we had quite a few things about fly tipping and, what was the other one I saw? Drug dealing and things like that. Do you know what? Drugs were a huge issue in the Victorian era, things like opium, and, there were huge opium dens in Victorian England. So although, again, a crime in today's society, not a modern crime, drug and alcohol abuse was rife in the Victorian era. So, but definitely lots of really good ideas. Now, my next thing for you is that chronology. As I said, you don't have to remember the actual date. So I have a degree in history at a postgrad, and I remember about 5 dates. So you don't have to remember the dates, but you do need to understand and remember and work out the order. So I'm going to turn my camera off so you get a better view. I have got some here that I've popped in order to kind of help you with your kind of working out which fits where. But I've got 5 question marks. And I want you to tell me what period of time these particular periods of time were. So try and work it out chronologically. So what's the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, and the fifth one? Now, I've popped in a few before. The Vikings, I've chucked in. The Normans, if you remember, 1066, which was the end of a particular period of time, which I nearly just blurted out, which would have been the answer. The Plantagenets, which we briefly talked about, came before the next one. And I've chucked in the Stuarts, which should help you work out the before period and the after period of the Stuarts. Can you remember those ones? So what's the first one? Do we remember what the first one is? We've got about just before 43 AD. So people saying Roman. The Romans. Let's have a look. Oh no, why is it? Do you know what? I've done a really bad. Why is that not? Do you know what? I had a problem with one of my things yesterday. Do you know what? That should miraculously, the question mark should just disappear. I'm having an awful lot of problems with my naughty computer. So let's go through it. The first one was the Romans, and then it was the Anglo-Saxons. And then just before the Stuarts is, what can you remember? Well, just before the Stuarts was the Tudors. In fact, sometimes it's called the Tudors and the Stuarts because they're obviously quite linked in the family tree. Then we have the Georgian era, which is where we looked at things like highway robbers, and then the Victorians. So the first one was Romans, then Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the Plantagenets, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Georgians, and the Victorians. So well done. Now, a really important thing to say is that it's just a rough kind of way of chunking British history, but obviously just to make it clear that it doesn't specifically end and start. There's kind of, life doesn't dramatically change because you've moved from the Tudors to the Stuarts. But well done. And naughty me for having a PowerPoint that doesn't work. Not sure why it's being a pain. Now, this is about coming to some conclusions today. And so what are we going to do is we're going to think about each period of time. We're going to kind of have a little recap chat. And I want you to think, while we're having this little recap chat, is what era in time do you think saw the greatest changes? So if you were going to chart, and I often used to do this with young people when we looked at chronology, we looked at something through time. It's literally put up, you could do this, make like a graph and have all the periods of time at the bottom, and then have like massive change at the top of your axis, and then at the bottom, like hardly any change. And then actually draw the line of where you think, where you saw the greatest changes, and where you saw kind of like a or maybe a and not very much change. So, for example, I personally don't think that there was a huge amount of change between the Roman and the Anglo-Saxon era. Not dramatically a difference in attitude, not dramatically a difference in what they deemed to be a crime, not particularly a dramatic difference in the types of punishments, and so on. So therefore, you need to think about what era in time saw the greatest changes. And when you're writing in the chat at any point, please make sure that that is relevant. Then the next thing we're going to think about, these are things you don't need to write right now, you're just thinking about this while we're going through it, is what era of time do you think was the most barbaric? And the last one is, what era of time do you think was the fairest? Okay. So our first thing to think about is the Roman era. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to try and remember what crime and punishment was like in the Roman era. Can you give me between 3, or you can say this at home, or you can think it, between 3 and 5 things about crime in the Roman era? Okay. So can we have a little think? We shouldn't be talking about scary movies in the chat because it's really not relevant to this session. So can you please make sure that you're keeping the chat to crime and punishment in the Roman era and not off task about films that aren't relevant? I'd like between 3 and 5 bits of remembering, bits of information of what you can remember about crime and punishment in the Roman era. So what was a crime? What was a punishment? How did they make people accountable for their crimes? So yeah, we've got a punishment of being fed to the lions. We'll give you sort of some thinking time with this one. Have a little think. The significance of the Roman era, if we remember, is how they found people accountable for their crimes. What was so significant about the Roman era? Gosh, making you think back 8 weeks, can we remember? Lots and lots to remember, I'm sure. Yes, there's no police force. Treason was a big thing. So talking about the emperor badly, really well remembered. Had a court system. Amazing. Right, shall we see how much we can remember? Judges and courts. Absolutely. So this era is very much, the theme of this era is to be as harsh as possible with the punishment. So that's the kind of theory in the Roman era, that if the punishment was as harsh as possible, then you'd be really scared and you wouldn't commit a crime. And so that was their kind of overall ethos. However, who remembers that if you were really rich, you could pay off you kind of for your crime, and you could have a less punishment. So do you remember, a really important thing about the Romans is that punishments were incredibly severe, but they weren't given out equally. So if you were an enslaved citizen, you had absolutely no rights. But if you were proper wealthy, you could kind of pay off and end up with a less of a fine. And lots of you got about the remembering that it was the worst crime of all was rebellion against the emperor. And we looked at the 12 tables, which were written at around 450 BC, which were laws that all of the Romans, so the Romans were really clear about what was and wasn't against the law. And we talked, we've got this one, the most significant thing also was the idea that there would be a jury and they would decide if you were guilty or not, if you had committed a series of crimes. And the legionnaires were partly responsible for trying to find criminals, but also if you had someone commit a crime against you, it was also kind of your responsibility to bring them to justice. On my screen, it says the live has ended. Not according to me, it hasn't. You might want a quick refresh. But if you think I'm not ended, if you think I'm ended, I don't know how you're going to hear that instruction. I think I'm still going. So well done. So very much, we're going to sum up the Romans in one sentence. Harsh, unfair, because it's based on your socio-economic sort of background on what punishments you got, but clear laws and a fair way of deciding whether somebody is guilty or not, because they had a jury and a judge, which is what we have today. Brilliant. Right, our next one. Can you remember what crime and punishment was like in the Roman era? What was crime and punishment like in the... my goodness. Do you know what? I need a holiday. No wonder it's session 8. Not the Roman era at all. Talking rubbish. Can you remember what crime and punishment was like in the Anglo-Saxon era? Come on, Chrissy, get your chronology right. The Anglo-Saxon era. This was my favourite. But remember those questions we're thinking of. What was the harshest era and what era saw the most change? So keep that in your head while you're thinking. So some people are saying, was this the time where they had the trials by ordeal? Tithings and Virgilt, the hue and cry. Well done, Jack. Lots of remembering. Can we remember what Virgild was? What was Virgild? And what was the hue and cry? I can't remember. You're gonna have to remind me. What do we think? Shall we? There's some really good remembering. Well done, you. So again, we're going to think about that continuity, which I've already spoken about. The Anglo-Saxons had the same attitude that if the punishments were really harsh, people wouldn't break the law. So there's that continuity between the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons, things that stayed the same. Lots of really severe punishments, from hanging to branding to whipping. And we definitely looked at those trials by ordeal, which were really interesting to look at. And if you remember the tithings, which actually we quite liked as an idea at the time, is that communities were divided into groups of 10 men, and these people, all 10 people, were responsible for everybody's behaviour. So if somebody was naughty in your 10, if you knew that your neighbour had nicked somebody else's pig, and you didn't actually bring them to account for it, then everybody in your tithing would be punished. So very much a way of trying to keep control. And if somebody did see somebody breaking the law, then you would shout out, and it was the law that everybody had to run and catch them, and it was called the hue and cry. We also looked at weergild. So if you were killed or injured, then your family would be paid a monetary amount of money. And we remember, if we looked at kind of how much an eye was, how much a finger was, how much an ear was, and such, and so and so. And also we talked about all the different trials by ordeal. So, for example, putting your hand into a vat of boiling water to retrieve a pebble from the bottom, and that if you and then you had it bandaged up, and then if you had an infection in it after a few days, then you were definitely guilty. And the reason behind this is because the Anglo-Saxons really believed that God was sort of judging people, and so if you had done the crime and you didn't have anybody to kind of back you up and say that you hadn't, if you did the trial by ordeal and then your arm got really infected, well, that's God giving everybody a message that you had broken the law. So something you can learn from this era is obviously a strong belief in religion. Right, let's move on. So we then moved on to the Tudor era. Can you remember what crime and punishment was like in the Tudor era? Let's get those thoughts going. Can you remember? If you're still having a problem, although you're not going to be hearing me, I'd potentially pop over to YouTube. What was life like in the Tudor era? Can you remember? What was the biggest crime in the Tudor era? Like the worst crime? Because that's another example of continuity. Lots of stealing, lots of beheadings, lots of worries about treason. Yes, if we're thinking about continuity again, that's exactly like the Roman era. Top crime in the Roman era, saying nasty things about the emperor and deciding that maybe you want to get rid of him. Biggest crime in the Tudor era, saying you don't like the monarchy and maybe we should get rid of them. So exactly the same. Exactly the same. So again, continuity, despite the fact that you're talking hundreds of years, exactly the same. Lots and lots. Lots of a problem with the poor, absolutely. So this is one of the big things that we know about the Tudor era, is the huge issue with the poor. Something that Queen Elizabeth tried really, really hard for. But yes, again, that continuity. Punishments were extremely severe. Executions were very, very common, particularly during the reign of Henry VIII. And the idea was that if you kind of, again, had the worst punishments ever, people would be too frightened to break the law. But there was a whole kind of era of worry. Every Tudor monarch, because of this kind of, which we did when we did the Tudors, so you're more than welcome to go and watch those lessons if you haven't seen them. But no monarch ever felt secure. The Tudors came after the War of the Roses, where we'd had kind of a lot of infighting between two parts of the same, two wings of the same family over who should be the king. And then when Henry VII became king and started off the Tudors, nobody ever felt particularly secure, and all of the monarchs felt very uneasy about treason. So therefore, the Tudors is something that really distinguishes them from others, is the high volumes of execution. And then we looked at some really, really sort of odd punishments, didn't we? So we talked about the scold's bridle. So, these random punishments that arrived. So if you were gossiping, then you were given the scold's bridle, which was like a sort of thing over your face and that went in your mouth, so women couldn't gossip. And then the drunkard's cloak. So if you were being a bit drunk and disorderly, you had to wear a big barrel and walk around the village or the town so that everybody kind of laughed at you. So yeah, lots of ridicule, lots and lots of ridicule was a really big element of the Tudor era. And then the last era of time that we've looked at is the Victorian era. Can you tell me what you think crime and punishment was like in the Victorian era? This should be really super easy because we've just done it. I'm really sorry for people having connection issues. I have full 6 bars of Wi-Fi and my tech says I am running A-OK. So I can only assume it's an issue at your end. Victorian era. What was crime and punishment like in the Victorian era? This is easy. The police were created, prisons were built. Why? Think of the chronological change. What was the huge chronological change in the Victorian era that led to these things? There's 2 things really. There's a change in attitude. Brilliant. So because of the kind of Tudors and the Stuarts and the Georgian era as well, which was a very much, not very pleasant. There was lots of hangings. You remember when we looked at the Georgian era, we looked at all of the crimes that you could be executed for. There were loads and loads and loads of crimes. Can you remember the bloody code where people could be, executed for cutting a tree down? And so people started to find it a little bit distasteful. People had found it distasteful for the whole of time, to be fair. I think not everybody would have rocked up to a gladiatorial arena in the Roman era. There's lots of written records of people saying it was disgusting and inhumane in the Roman era. But people suddenly really changed in attitudes due to the Georgian era. And so we really moved in the Victorian era towards attitudes. It wasn't really to do with the religion, because obviously you couldn't have got more religious in the Tudor era. It was just a kind of human shift in attitude that actually what we saw in the Victorian era is industrial revolution. And so we see people moving from into towns and cities, and we see a general change in attitude during this whole period. At the start of the Victorian era, there's very much what's known as a laissez-faire attitude. Well, if you're poor, it's your own fault. And if you're having to steal, it's your own fault. And so it's nothing to do with religion. It's to do with just a change in sort of human attitudes, that actually now we've got huge towns and cities, we've got a boom in population, we've got huge industrialization with factories and machines, and just a change in attitude occurs during this time where we actually start to think, you know what, not everybody, but maybe the poor are poor because of their circumstances and not because they're lazy. And so this is where you see that huge shift from retribution to reform. And it's something we talked about that we still struggle with today, because actually if people are victims of a crime, quite often they want retribution still, particularly if they're a victim of a hideous crime. This attitude towards retribution is still there. It's a natural human instinct, but overall we have moved, due to the Victorian era, to this idea of reform. And so don't forget also, it was this period of time where we started to transport people that had broken the law all the way around the world to places like Australia. And we also looked at Victorian prisons with the idea that if you did lots of hard labour, you would somehow be reformed. So then that comes back to the conclusions I asked you to think about. What era do you think saw the greatest change? What era do you think was the most barbaric? And in what era do you think was the fairest? Now, these are things that you can have as your own interpretation. So let's pick the last one, which era in time was the fairest. You could argue the Roman era and the Greek eras, because these were the times where we first started to have a trial by jury. So there's a good argument for there. You could argue no time is you could argue that maybe the Victorian time is fairest because there's more based on reform, but still, even today, we have miscarriages of justice. What era in time do you think is the most barbaric? Well, again, you could argue that the Anglo-Saxon era is, because the trials by ordeal. You could argue that, the hue and cry and the tithings is no more than basically lynching people. You could argue that the most barbaric was the Victorian era, because actually putting people into prisons and making them do hard labour for years on end is pretty barbaric. So again, what time saw the greatest changes? Again, you could argue that. You could argue it's the modern era, you could argue it's the Victorian era, you could argue it's the ancient period where they first started to come up with the idea of trial by jury. But whichever one you do, I want you to take some time because you need to be having a because. So if you want to have a discussion about this or add it to the chat, you need to give at least 3 reasons for your answers. So if you were in an exam at GCSE and they said, which era of time saw the greatest changes to crime and punishment, and you went the Victorians because they had prisons, you get nil point. You have to explain in detail your argument, your opinion, your interpretation. And the reason behind that is because, honestly, if you go to an academic library with hundreds and hundreds of books on crime and punishment through time, written by 100 different historians, they'll all think something different, because everybody has a different interpretation of the past. So something for you to think on a little bit more. But definitely, we have seen throughout these 8 weeks a move, a shift from retribution to reform. Now, thinking about modern crime and prevention and detection, how has modern crime changed? What methods do we use now to help detect people breaking the law? How do we do it now? So we've got many more ways of finding criminals. This is our last little activity to get us thinking. I want you to come back to those 3 big questions later. And if you want to write me an answer, then do so. But how else has crime moved on? This is our last activity. How do we catch criminals now? How has that change developed? DNA, absolutely. Criminal databases. So we definitely have databases of people that have broken the law, fingerprints, security cameras, absolutely. So we've seen a move from retribution to reform, but also we have now seen a move in the modern era to prevention. So one of the arguments, and again, this is not for me to get into because a lot of people, we haven't got the time, but a lot of people don't like CCTV because they think it's actually too intrusive in our lives. But actually prevention, like CCTV, prevents a lot of crimes from actually happening in the first place, because you're less likely to commit a crime if you think it's being recorded. And also we've developed a lot of more detection methods like fingerprints and DNA and all of those things. So I have a question for you. These are ways that we deal with modern crime. And I've got 3 things for you to think about. I'm going to pop one up and I want you to think, does this help stop crime or does it help prevent it? So is this something you're going to use after the crime's happened, or is it something you're going to use to prevent crime from happening? And the third thing I want you to think about is this definitely a modern thing, or have we done this before in the past? So it will help you a little bit as we go. So DNA testing. Does this help, do you think, stop crime from happening? Or do you, do you use this sort of after the crime to sort of help stop and resolve the crime? Does DNA testing resolve the crime, or does it prevent the crime from happening? And do you think we did DNA testing before the 21st century. Absolutely. So we definitely use DNA testing after the crime. And it's really hard not to drop your DNA. We're dropping our DNA all the time. So if there's a hair, I mean, my dogs are dropping their DNA everywhere because I have a wooden floor down here and one of my dogs is molting and it's pretty much a carpet of dog hair because I haven't hoovered today. I mean, my dog's definitely dropping her DNA all over my carpet, but you just drop one single bit of hair, then that's got your DNA on it. A bit of your spit, got your DNA on it. A bit of your blood, got your DNA on it. So it definitely helps solve crimes and is used after a crime because, as I said, you can pick, but you need to obviously find the suspect because you need to take their DNA. Lots of people saying it's modern. It absolutely is. Right, using CCTV or video footage, does this help with resolving a crime that's happened, or does it help prevent the crime? And do we think it's modern or happened before? Ooh. It is modern, so we got that one right. I'm gonna so yeah, you can use it after the crime to provide evidence, absolutely. But you can also, it stops people potentially committing the crime in the first place. And it definitely is modern. So Nathaniel, you are right. It's definitely both. CCTV. So quite often if something's happened on the news, they say, you know, these are the last known movements of this suspect, and they'll like show a camera shot. But it's definitely modern. Use of fingerprints. Is it a modern thing? Has it happened in the past? And does it help prevent crime, or does it help solve crime? Yes, it helps solve a crime because we all have individual fingerprints. Even identical twins have individual fingerprints. So it does help solve a crime. Is it modern? Is it a modern way of dealing with crime? It is. It's a modern thing. We've only really had the technology to be able to scan fingerprints and check them in the modern era. What about neighbourhood watch? They often see little stickers in people's windows. I'm part of neighbourhood watch, and you all kind of sign up and you all like watch people in your community and make sure everybody's kind of doing the right thing. What does that do? Does that help prevent crime? Does it help solve crime? And is it a modern thing or an old thing? It is. It's a prevention. I'm not actually sure how you join up, but it is. It's a really old thing because that's what the hue and cry and the tidings exactly were. That was basically their version of neighbourhood watch. You're all in a big group and you all have to make sure, keep an eye on everybody, and if they don't, you shout about it. So definitely really very old. It's Anglo-Saxon, although they didn't call it a neighbourhood watch. Right, a trial by judge and jury. Does that help prevent crime? Does it help solve crime? And is it an old thing? This is an easy one. Or is it a modern thing? Oh, well done. Jack worked out it was tidings. Well, we know that the trial by jury, that's about solving crimes. It is ancient. The Romans, lots of evidence suggests the Greeks were doing it too, but it definitely helps solve a crime and should be a fair way of bringing people to justice. Right, the police. Do the police prevent crime? Do they help solve the crime? And are they modern? This is an easy one. They're from the Victorian era, and they do prevent crime in theory, because if you remember, the Victorian era was about bobbies on the beat, so walking a particular pathway in order to make sure everybody was doing the right thing. And obviously they hopefully, I would hope, solve crimes too. Gathering witnesses to a crime, again, don't really need much thinking time. That helps you to solve a crime. And again, this is something that we've seen all the way back in the Roman and Anglo-Saxon era. If you had been accused of something naughty, you'd have to try and get somebody to vouch for you. So that idea of an alibi that we use today in order to help solve crimes goes all the way back to the Roman and the Anglo-Saxon. House and car alarms. That's an easy one. That's a modern one, isn't it? And the idea of that is to help prevent crime from happening. And our last one is improved street lighting, which is again a very modern thing to do. Lots of people don't like it, again, because it causes humongous light pollution, particularly if you like stargazing. But with the invention of electricity, we do have improved street lighting. We're no longer relying on like the Victorian era where they were using gas lamps, and up into the 19th century, what improved street lighting. So electrical bright street lighting, which in theory should help prevent crimes, which is why if you've got some people have house lighting as well that automatically comes on if it detects movement. So that's it for me. Don't forget to think about those huge questions, those huge chronological questions of what saw the most change and which era was the fairest and which era was the kind of most barbaric. Don't forget, if you haven't already, up in the description above or down in the description below, the Time Explorers pack for you to download. And there's lots of activities that you can do this week, including what era did you find the most interesting. So I make lots of videos. It's over to you to make some videos. Can you create me a short 2-minute video that shares everything that you've learnt about crime and punishment and would inspire people to find out more. You can use the crime and punishment challenge cards included in the pack to help you explore other different eras. You can go and learn about the Derek Bentley case, because that is a significant case if you're an older learner to how the death penalty was removed. There's a few GCSE questions on there, and something you could maybe make a poster, crime and punishment poster, or a huge timeline on the back of some old wallpaper. So there's lots of activities that you can get involved in. Now, something to say is what's coming up next term. So we are taking a break for the summer, and we will be back the week commencing the 11th of September. And this is what what our live lessons are going to look like. So if you join Pathfinders on a Monday, that will be taking place on a Monday morning at 11 a.m. With Kirsty, because we have got something super exciting. On Mondays at 1 o'clock, we are going to be launching a brand new lesson called Languages at Lunch. And we're going to start with Spanish. And I have got a very exciting person that's going to be leading that, a lady called Beth. So we've got a new teacher on board on Mondays at 1 o'clock, and we're going to be doing some Spanish. On Tuesday, in this slot, Time Explorers, we're going to be looking at ancient Maya. On Wednesdays, we are going to be looking at tectonics, part of our geography-based sessions. Imagination Station is back on a Thursday. And if you join me on a Friday for book club, and I see you on Friday, pretend I haven't told you this, because I'm going to do a big announcement on Friday. But if you act surprised, but on Friday, we've got a new book club, which will be Phyllis and the Fossil Finders. So that will be starting week commencing the 11th of September. So what on earth am I going to do over the summer, Chrissy? I hear you cry. I cannot cope without seeing your wonderful face every week. Well, don't worry. I'm sure you're not saying that at all. Don't worry, because we have coming soon our summer initiative for this year, which is the Twinkl Sprinkle Challenge. And it's going to be running for the 6 weeks of the summer break. And it is going to be lots and lots of challenges given. So there's going to be 5 challenges a week for you to get your teeth into. You can do 1, we can do all 5. and they're all linked to our online lesson content. So it's going to be challenges for Pathfinders and challenges for history, explorers, and all of the different lessons that we challenges for book club. And I'm not going to say any more than that because I don't want to spoil it. But we definitely have lots of things to keep you entertained over the summer holidays. So look out in our Facebook group for a message from Lizzie sharing all of the information about that, because that is what we're working on behind the scenes and will be coming shortly soon in July. So you've got a few weeks to finish off all the activities in the pack for this session. If you do, don't forget to go share them over on Facebook, particularly if you make that video, because I'd love to see some videos. And who knows, they might, you might be able to take over my job if they're that awesome. And I will pop in the chat the Children's University codes if that's something you're collecting. And that's me, over and out. So I will see you soon. Have a lovely break, and I'll see you for Twinkl Sprinkle really, really soon. Have a lovely time. See you soon.